Welcome to lesson number 10 in our series entitled Let's Take Another Look, as we look at gospel passages related to the life of Jesus. I made mention in the last lesson that lesson number 9 and this lesson would be kind of a two-parter. And so we pick up now with, as part of the trial of Jesus, of when they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate, starting in chapter 23, reading verses 1 through 12. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then they put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. So in this trial, they send Jesus from the high priest to Pontius Pilate. And the scene shifts from a religious to a legal setting. Now notice there's a charge that they add in front of Pilate to help make their case that Jesus deserves to be executed for treason, not against anything with the Jewish people, but against the Roman Empire. The first accusation they make is that he is speaking out against paying taxes to the emperor, a charge that is clearly a lie. In fact, when questioned in a time when the Pharisees and scribes had tried to trick Jesus, they had asked him the question, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor?" If he had said yes, then they would have accused him of being unfaithful to the Jewish people. And if he had said no, then they would have gone, like they did anyway, to the Roman officials and said, "Listen, he's advocating not paying taxes." Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and render unto God that which is God's." So here, having failed earlier in an attempt to try to trick Jesus into saying something that they could bring a charge, here they just flat out lie and say this is what he has been teaching. The second accusation they make is that Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah. Now, for the Roman people, the claim to be the Messiah wouldn't have meant much, but they add that a king, in other words, that this is one who is going to come and have authority that would be even greater than the emperor, and that the people would follow. Now, both of these charges have a common thread, and it's that they were considered acts of subversion and treason to the Roman Empire. Pilate doesn't respond to the first charge, but he does ask Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus gives the same response that he gave to the high priest, which is, "You say so." Now, the one thing to say about the Roman courts is that they did require evidence, and by and large were considered to be fair courts in these types of things. There was at least some semblance of due process, even if it's not the same as what we know today. And so when Jesus is handed over by Pilate, it's done in accordance with the wishes of the crowd when that time comes up in a little bit. And so this doesn't excuse Pilate in any way, but it does show that no matter what was going to happen here, these events were set in motion by God. And these events that were set in motion were going to be fulfilled. But going back and forth from the high priest to Pilate to Herod, and as we'll see in just a minute, back to Pilate, then it highlights that by any measure that Jesus was innocent. Well, Pilate here says, I don't find any accusation against this man. And they keep accusing him and trying to figure something out. And so when he finds out that Jesus is originally from Galilee, he says, that's in the Herod's jurisdiction, the Herod that was over the Galilean region. So he says, I'm going to send you to Herod. Well, Herod is in Jerusalem because of the Passover. And notice that Herod is glad to get this case. He's been wanting to meet Jesus and figure out what he is all about, partly because, or mainly because, he is hoping to see Jesus perform some miracle or some other sign. But of course, Jesus isn't there to entertain Herod's whim, and he never did these things for any reason other than helping others to demonstrate the coming kingdom of God. So of course, Jesus refuses to do anything. Well, Herod then can't find any charge against Jesus that's going to stick. So not in the religious courts, not in the legal courts, is there anything that is going to stick. Although when Jesus won't conform to Herod's wishes, Herod and the other soldiers along with him, begin to mock Jesus. And it reminds us that throughout this entire time, he was beaten and mocked, even though he was totally innocent. And just think about how Jesus is by this point. He's been arrested late at night. He's been beaten. He's been transferred back and forth, handed over to different officials, asked the same questions over and over again. And throughout this, the only consistent thing has been these chief priests and scribes who are vehemently accusing him at every turn. And yet Jesus still says very little. He knows what must happen, and he's not going to do anything to get in that way. Well, then if we pick up with chapter 23, verses 13 through 16, this story kind of continues on. Remember, now he's sent from Herod back to Pilate again. And picking up at 23, verse 13. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to me, You brought me this man as one who is perverting the people. And yet, here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged, and will release him. Now, of course, at this point, Pilate doesn't really know what to do. The situation is really an irritant to Pilate. It's the second time for them to be back in his court. Herod is sending back to Pilate. Nobody can find any actual proof of any charge against Jesus. And it's important to think about the fact that for Pilate, this really would have been an irritation. We know much of the history of the Jewish people and their situation through the Bible, through the Old Testament. There are other writings that are out there. But in the context of the Roman Empire in ancient times, at this time, the Jewish people were not considered that significant. The Roman Empire was vast. It stretched over thousands of miles. And this little nation of conquered people just wasn't that important as they saw it at the time in the big scheme of things. And yet Pilate is over this area administering it. But this has taken a good bit of Pilate's time in what clearly looks like to Pilate as an internal matter that the Jewish authorities need to be dealing with for themselves and quit bothering him and taking up his time. So Pilate is going to have Jesus flogged. I guess you just flog for good measure. I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. I'm just going to flog him and then release him and let him go. But of course, that's not exactly what has happened. So we continue on and we pick up at verses 17 through 23 to see what happens next. They all shouted together, Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us. Barabbas was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, Crucify him! Crucify him! A third time he said to them, Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no grounds for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him. But they kept, that's the crowd, they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. Now, the custom apparently around this time of the year was to release somebody during the time of the Passover festival. Now, in one way, it would seem kind of an odd custom. Why would you want someone like a murderer released, and why would they want to release someone like a murderer? But usually what happened in the midst of this is that the person released might have been somebody who was a political prisoner. Maybe it was somebody who had been just advocating very forcefully for the people of Israel and had irritated the authorities, and they had thrown him in prison. And so kind of almost as a goodwill act, around the time of Passover, such an important time, and maybe to kind of help keep the peace, and they might release somebody who might be in what we would consider this day to be a political prisoner, someone who may have spoken against the Roman Empire but had not taken any direct type of action. And so Pilate's going to release Jesus. Jesus kind of fits that. He actually hasn't done anything. He can kind of fulfill this custom to release Jesus instead of having to release somebody else. But notice by this point, what's happened is that the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees have really riled up the crowd at this point. And so they are there and then and among the crowd. And the crowd begins to shout, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate knows Jesus is innocent, and he knows that Barabbas is a dangerous man, not a political insurrectionist, not just a political insurrectionist, but also a murderer. So he plans to release Jesus. But the people cry for Jesus to be crucified and Barabbas to be released. And after the third time that Pilate says he's going to release Jesus, and notice that number 3 again, that time of completion. And after the crowd continues to call for Jesus' crucifixion, Pilate agrees and hands Jesus over to be crucified. He puts it in such a strong way. Their voices prevailed. And in the midst of this, this time of Passover, the whole city was kind of a powder keg. The numbers had swelled to hundreds of thousands, maybe even between 1 and 2 million people there for the Passover celebration. The people had expected the Messiah to come, and so this time, right now, the city of Jerusalem is just a powder keg. It's just waiting to explode. All that needs to happen is some sort of spark, either intentional or even unintentional, and the Roman officials know they're going to have trouble on their hands, and they're trying to do everything they can to kind of keep the temperature low, trying to keep things tamped down so that there is no spark that happens to set off the crowds. And so when the crowds continually cry for Jesus to be crucified, it says their voices prevailed, and Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. Now there are two big ironies present here. The first is that it is the chief priests and the scribes who pervert the people, not Jesus. Remember, they had accused, the chief priests and scribes had accused Jesus of perverting the people and the things that he said. But it's the chief priests and the scribes who stir up the crowd, not Jesus. And the second irony, and just shows you how they, again, had a verdict in mind and they were just looking for something to justify it. The second irony is that they stir up the crowd, the people, to call for the release of somebody who is in jail for the very same thing they accused Jesus of, which is insurrection. That's what they had accused Jesus of, and saying he's inciting the people. He's trying to incite the people to subversion and treason. And so these things indicate the false nature of the accusations and the true motives of the chief priests and the scribes in regard to their actions against Jesus. In the Gospel of Mark, he makes mention that Pilate wanted to please the crowd. And that statement is a telling one that probably would have had a greater impact for the readers who first read the Gospels than it might for us today. Because they knew that in most instances, Pilate really didn't care about whether or not he upset the crowd. But because of what I talked about just a moment ago with this particular situation of Passover and the height of passions at this time, maybe Pilate's trying to do whatever he can to please the crowd and keep them from maybe rioting and revolting against the Roman government at all. Now, before we move on and look at the actual crucifixion itself, I think it does bear mention to just take a point of reflection with this lesson, with this part of the lesson, and then the lesson from before, when we see the reaction of the crowd. And I didn't talk about the Palm Sunday. If you're interested in that, I would encourage you, if you're on this site, to go to the April 2nd morning worship service. In that sermon, I talk about Palm Sunday, and I talk about the triumphal entry and all that takes place there. But it is interesting that throughout this, the institution of the Lord's Supper, the Gethsemane, the arrest, the trial, all these things that happen, how some of our reactions mimic the reactions of the people of the day. Sometimes we are like Peter. We think ourselves as very faithful, and we may even occasionally take a strong stand, but in the end we end up denying him by our words or our deeds out of fear of ridicule or maybe consequences of proclaiming him in our day and time. We're afraid of what people will think of us. We're sometimes like the crowd in allowing what we say and do to be influenced by leaders who have their own agenda and are trying to bring us along, even if it's something that is not helpful for us. It is helpful to them, and so they use all of their influence to try to get us upset and to respond in a particular way, and to respond in such a way that even if we stopped and really did think about it, if we saw, we react in a way that if we saw someone else doing it, we would be appalled. We are sometimes like the chief priest and the leaders who predetermine the outcome and then look for ways to justify it. We know what we want to happen, and then we backtrack and try to come up with reasons to justify doing what it is we want to do, instead of going forth and submitting to God's will and asking for God's guidance. Sometimes we're like Pilate. We're just apathetic. We don't really care. And it's easier to listen to the loudest than the most insistent voices instead of stopping and doing what is right. We are sometimes like Barabbas, maybe utilizing or supporting violence as a means to achieve what we think is right, even though Christ tells us that there is no justification for that use of violence and all the different things that he tells us to do. Sometimes we may even be like Jesus. We are unjustly accused and wronged, and yet we forgive anyway, even when an injustice is done to us. I think we can see ourselves at different points, at different times of faithfulness or unfaithfulness in these different reactions of those that we see in Scripture. Now I want to turn to the actual crucifixion of Christ. I'm reading from the Gospels of Luke and Mark. I'm going to read extensive sections, and I'm going to read them back to back. Now, I would encourage you, if you don't have your Bible right in front of you, you may want to pause and find these passages in the Bible, and maybe kind of keep your finger on them and go back and forth and look at them. And as I read these, and as you read along, hopefully, then one of the things I encourage you to do is to maybe even take a quick couple of little notes. Maybe even just pause the video and go back and take a couple of notes yourself before continuing on to see what are similarities and differences between these two crucifixion accounts. I didn't read all of them, but I'm reading two, and I'm reading extensive sections. I'm going to be reading the two passages I'm going to read come from Luke 23, verses 26 to 55, and then Mark 15, verses 21 to 47. So I'm going to start with Luke 23, starting with verse 26, going through verse 55. As they led Jesus away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right hand and one on his left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him and offering sour wine and saying, If you are the King of Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who hanged there kept deriding him and saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus replied, Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It was about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, Surely this man was innocent. When all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. He came from the Jewish town of Arimathea, and he was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb, where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. Now I'm going to read from Mark chapter 15, verses 21 to 47. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, The King of the Jews. And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. In the same ways, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, Listen, he is calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on his stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last. He said, Truly this man was God's son. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who himself was also waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where the body was laid. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about Simon of Cyrene. I make mention of this, although I go into a little bit detail, on the March 26th sermon from the Sunday morning worship service. But I'm going to kind of give a little brief synopsis of these things. The first thing is to think about when we look at Simon of Cyrene about we never know when, where, how, or through whom God will choose to work and maybe even change a life. Simon of Cyrene is a great example of this reality in Scripture. There are a couple of possibilities about Simon and where he lived, where he came from. One, it makes mention that he's from Cyrene. So one possibility is that he's originally from Cyrene and is now living in the area, and he might have just come from the countryside and from a nearby area near Jerusalem, and he's in town for the Passover. It's also possible that Simon had traveled all the way from Cyrene to Jerusalem for the Passover, because it was expected of faithful Jews that they would attend at least one Passover in their lifetime, if at all possible. If Simon came from Cyrene at this exact time, it means he traveled a long way. And whenever it was that he had come to this area, being originally from Cyrene, he would have traveled a long way. Cyrene is located in North Africa, where modern-day Libya is located, around 900 miles from Jerusalem. And if you think about this, even traveling as much as 20 miles a day on an animal, that's a 6-week trip. That's a 45-day or longer trip. And when we go back to, and we know that there was a presence there in North Africa, that there was a Jewish presence there, going all the way back to different times in which when Israel had been conquered, and in different times where the Jewish people had been scattered, even further back to Solomon's relationship with the Queen of Sheba in what's now known as Ethiopia. There had been a Jewish presence in Africa. And we know later on that Cyrene was an early location for a good, strong Christian community that was way away from where everything else. Even though things hadn't spread much in between, that was an early center for Christianity, probably in part due to Simon of Cyrene, or that's the speculation. Well, wherever Simon was from, or originally from, wherever he came from in this particular moment, he's in Jerusalem, and he's caught up in carrying this cross as an unwilling participant in what turns out to be one of the most significant events in human history. The indication is that Simon wasn't necessarily there to see Jesus. Both Mark and Luke describe Simon as a passerby. And Mark uses a particular word for what is translated in English as passerby. Mark uses a particular Greek word that is used only 2 other times in the Gospels. And one of those times is when Jesus is walking on the shore, on the Sea of Galilee, and he calls Peter. The other time that this word for passerby is used, is when Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector to follow him. In other words, in the only other 2 times where this word for passerby is used, and Luke doesn't use the same word, it's translated the same in English. Luke even uses a different word than Mark does. And so the only other times in which this word is used, it is a prelude to a call story. It's to Jesus calling someone to follow him. And although we have no recorded direct conversation between Jesus and Simon of Cyrene, the indication is that this ends up being what leads Simon to become a follower of Jesus. When we think about, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that in just a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about him being compelled to carry the cross. Now, for most of us, when we think about Simon carrying the cross, we tend to see in our mind's eye these depictions from passion plays or maybe from movies, where Jesus is carrying the big long cross, and he's having to drag it along, and he kind of has the T-shaped part of the cross, that's over his shoulder. And then he's too weak to do that, and Simon picks it up. But that's not really how it would have been. What he would have been carrying would have been the crossbeam, and he would have had it there in his arms. His hands would have been nailed there to that crossbeam, and he would have been. They wouldn't have been nailed at this time, but he would have been forced to kind of carry that at the time. And what happened was they would carry that crossbeam, and then when they got to the place of the crucifixion, in this case Golgotha, they would lay them back. Then they would nail the hands and feet to the cross. They would attach the crossbeam to the vertical beam, and then they would attach them, and then they would just kind of like with a rope, they would pull it up and brace the cross there in place. And that's how they would have done that and embraced the entire cross. So that's one difference. Another difference from the way that it is so often depicted is that it's also depicted as if Jesus was way high up in the air, maybe 9, 10, 11, or 12 feet. But really it wouldn't have been up that high. And neither would he and the others who were being crucified been way off by themselves on a hill. Remember, people are passing by this area. A good bit of the time, and most likely, if it followed the other patterns, it would have been right along the side of a main road. And the cross wouldn't have been elevated. Jesus might have only just been a couple of feet, above them, maybe even, pretty close to eye level, not just way up high, but where they would have been able to go. They could have spit on him, probably spit in his face. They could have come and offered him that wine, maybe with a little stick. And so what I'm trying to get at with this is that we're talking about an incredible intimacy in one of the most horrific means of execution ever devised, where people could come right up. They would have been stripped, they would have been naked, and they're just right up there, subject to whatever ridicule, whatever it is that anybody wants to do to them, right there, right by the side of the road, just a few feet higher than the people would have been in the first place. Now, and so this is the situation of the crucifixion. Now, I want to make one other quick mention about Simon before we go to the other parts of the crucifixion. In the Gospel of Mark gives us a detail Luke does not. Mark is the first gospel written out of the four. Mark's the first one written. In the Gospel of Mark, Simon of Cyrene is identified as the father of Alexander and Rufus. Well, Rufus is recognized by Paul, is mentioned specifically by Paul in Romans 16:13, and all the scholars agree that it is the same person. And so by the time Mark gets around to writing the Gospels, people would have known who Rufus was. Remember, even though the Gospels come first in our Bible, Paul wrote Romans many years before, maybe as much as 10 to 15 years before Mark wrote his Gospel. And so by the time Mark writes the Gospel, Alexander and Rufus, and again Paul specifically mentions Rufus, would have been people who had been known and maybe had even been leaders in the early church, enough so that when Mark is writing this Gospel, those who are reading it there in the early church probably had a strong idea who Rufus and Alexander were. Otherwise, it wouldn't make much sense for Mark just to kind of mention it. And so just a little bit of speculation here is that it kind of, the indication is, with that use of the word passerby, with the identification of Alexander and Rufus, with what we know later that Cyrene was an early center of Christianity, even though there was not much Christianity not really spread between those areas of Israel and kind of Asia Minor, those Greek areas had not spread consistently that far down. That all the indications is that after Simon is compelled to carry that cross, then after the fact, he becomes a follower of Jesus. So then if Rufus and Alexander become leaders in the early church, this seemingly happenstance coincidence where Simon is just there in the crowd, whether he is there to see a crucifixion, whether he's just literally passing by and literally is just in the crowd, maybe trying to get from one place to the other, and the huge crowd is gathered and he gets pulled in. Whatever it is, it seems like this was the entry point to Simon's faith in Jesus, and then look at the influence that happened there all the way down the line. And we can't help but wonder how many generations of families and other people have the lives of how many generations of families were changed and impacted for all eternity by a, quote, chance encounter with Jesus. Now I want to move on to the actual crucifixion itself and then some of those other details. One thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go into gory detail about the crucifixion. I didn't put any things, I'm not putting any things on the website. If you want to learn a little bit more about some of the actual particulars, I'll mention a few particulars. But if you want to learn all the really deep ins and outs, and there are a lot of good websites that are out there. They have they have pictures, to show those types of things. And it reminds us, and it does remind us in a very powerful way what Jesus went through for us, so the extent of that suffering. But we don't have to know all those details to understand and appreciate even what we know from the Scriptures itself is sufficient to understand what it is that Jesus and how much Jesus suffered for us. We know that he was flogged by Herod and Pilate before he was crucified. We know that the whips had metal spikes meant to inflict maximum damage. Helps explain why he didn't have the strength to carry the crossbeam. The nails that are so often depicted as going through the hand, in all likelihood really went through the wrist because the palm of the hand didn't have a strong enough bone structure to be able to support the weight of Jesus up there on the cross. The nail in the feet would have gone through both feet at one time, and meaning that it inflicts a maximum amount of pain, but in a way that doesn't kill somebody, where they suffer for an extended period of time. When one was crucified, they might die from excess blood loss, but they often died from asphyxiation, from suffocating to death, because they weren't able to hold themselves up that entire time. And just the pressure of trying to hold themselves up as they sagged, everything would have come and eventually just kind of cut off those airways. Crucifixion was designed to inflict maximum pain, maximum humiliation. And it's why it was reserved for the most egregious of crimes, such as murder, runaway slave, or advocating insurrection. And it's also why they would have had it close enough where people could go by and jeer at them and mock them and spit at them and taunt them and do all those things that we did. Now, one thing Luke includes that Mark doesn't is this word about sorrow, that a word of woe that he pronounces for those who are following behind wailing. And he makes kind of a cryptic statement about green and dry wood. If this is what happens when the wood is green, what happens when it is dry? It seems to suggest that he says, now, if people are in such a state of oppression and loss, now in a time of plenty, in a time of abundance of harvest and rain, what will happen when there's that time of crisis and uncertainty? If people can't handle the good times, what will happen when the bad times come? Or another way of saying it is that if Jesus is crucified in his innocence, then what's the fate not only of other innocents, but also the fate of the guilty? And we know that because of our sin, all of us are guilty. And so he says, if they're doing this to an innocent person, then what's the fate of those who are guilty? As Jesus hangs there on the cross, people are walking by. They're walking by, casting insults. And although in Luke's account, Mark talks about the people going by, in Luke's account, it's the leaders and the soldiers only who do the taunting. And with all that they do, the only statement and response that we have from Jesus is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. In these taunts, by the people in the crowd, by the soldiers, by the religious authorities, we see one last final temptation of Jesus. Notice the language that is found in Mark, and I made mention in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the lesson in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then make mention again here. In Luke chapter 4, verse 13, at the end of when Jesus is tempted, it says the devil left him until an opportune time. There's an opportune time in the Garden of Gethsemane, and now there's an opportune. Notice the wording of the language there in Luke. If you are the Son of God, if this person is the Son of God, then why doesn't he save himself? Again, it's the same type of syntax that the devil gives to him in the midst of when he's tempted by the devil. Well, in the Gospel of Luke, so Jesus is crucified then with one on his right and one on his left. Now, in Luke, one continues to taunt him, but the other recognizes Jesus' innocence. And I don't know if Luke specifically meant to make this point, the following point, but it is the case that the reactions of the two thieves in many ways kind of mimics and demonstrates the different reactions to Jesus even unto today. Some see Jesus as a fraud, upon who people have heaped all these other things. Maybe at best a regular human being on whom people in that day and time cast divinity, but they fail to see him for who he is and actually kind of see him more as a fraud. Others see Jesus as the divine Son of God who suffered even for our sake, even though he was innocent. And the thief says, we're guilty. We deserve what we've done. Jesus is innocent. He says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus gives those wonderful words, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. So notice that you have this man who has not known anything about Jesus. He's never done one thing in the midst. He's there being crucified because of something that he had been done that merited that crucifixion according to the laws of the day. And yet in that statement of faith and that recognition of Jesus for who he is, Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. In other words, when you die, this is where you go. Now we fast forward a few hours, and not too many hours, we have the final words of Jesus in Luke, where he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And as he gives up his spirit, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. Now this tearing of the temple, of the curtain of the temple in two, is much a theological statement, and much more a theological statement than it was them trying to make any point of historical fact. What Luke and Mark are getting at with the death of Jesus, that the separation between God and humanity is no more. The curtain that's referred to here in the temple is the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. The Holy of Holies was where the Ark of the Covenant was, and it was believed that the presence of God dwelled. Only the high priest was allowed into this area, and only then on the Day of Atonement. But with the death of Jesus, all persons can come to faith in Jesus Christ. Joseph of Arimathea then comes and asks for the body of Jesus. He wraps up the body in cloth and lays the body in a tomb that's never before been used. The body can't be prepared fully for burial because of the hour approaching the Sabbath. And thus it sets the scene for the women to come see him on that first Easter morning. And notice it says the women go and make sure they know where Jesus is. But then they return to their home because it was too late to do what they're going to do that first Easter morning. When we look at Mark, then what we see is that that there are some very similar details there along with Luke. One of those other details that is similar as well with some others is that there is a mention of myrrh mixed with wine. Myrrh was an analgesic, and so some believe it might have been an act of compassion by somebody watching to try to keep Jesus from suffering. But notice Jesus doesn't take the myrrh. Mark, though, could have been making a theological statement by tying one of the gifts given at his birth with the same gift being given at his death. The story of the Magi, of course, is found only in Matthew, but Mark was probably familiar with that story. Now, there is a difference in Mark from Luke. that has to do, and the biggest difference has to do with the thieves on the cross. Notice that in Mark says that both of the thieves taunted Jesus. Well, why might there be this discrepancy? Did both taunt him or only one? There's a couple of possibilities here. One is that, and the primary possibility is that Luke wanted to emphasize the total innocence of Christ, which even one of the thieves could see. And so to indicate until the very end, he wanted to indicate until the very end, Jesus was demonstrating the extreme mercy and forgiveness of God. And Mark wasn't as concerned about that. Mark, remember, being the first one written. And so Matthew and Luke, we believe, had access to Mark. And so Luke maybe maybe learned some bit of information later that Mark didn't have, or Luke chooses to do this and tell the story in such a way to try to emphasize that forgiveness of Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then this forgiveness of the thief upon the cross that we see in Luke. There's another little bit of a difference in that Mark and Luke have Jesus crying out some different things. He could have cried out all of them, but they have them crying out different things. Jesus cries out in Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, many have read this and said that Jesus makes this complaint against God in the midst of its agony in order to have God and to recognize that in this moment, in the time of his crucifixion, God had to turn his back on Jesus for him to be able to suffer in his sacrifice for us. But I really think that that that's kind of a limited understanding, and I think the way that I understand it and the way that I have seen it described and that I kind of hold to is that I think it's much deeper than that. I think it's more powerful than that even, and I think it's kind of an incomplete understanding. One of the things, and let me kind of go through that. One of the things that sometimes folks might do is stating the full meaning of a psalm would just be to quote the first line or two, and to kind of by that it was implied that they were repeating the entire psalm. It's similar to things like if we were to say to somebody, well, you know what they say about people in glass houses, or we go, sticks and stones, sticks and stones. We don't say the entire axiom. We don't say the entire statement because we know and we believe that other people understand the meaning of that. So we don't have to say the whole thing. It's a shorthand way of stating the whole meaning of that axiom. Well, when children received instruction, when they went to school through the age of 13, the instruction that children received in school was religious training. And the training was they learned the scriptures. They learned to memorize. They memorized the scriptures. They repeated them orally. Many people could not, most people were illiterate, and so they couldn't write the scriptures, but they listened to them and they repeated them orally. And so they would have known these psalms, including this entire psalm that Jesus is quoting from when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so it's quite possible, and I think it's likely, that instead of quoting the entire psalm, Jesus quotes a part of the psalm here as an expression of the full meaning of the entire psalm. And I want to read for you, I'm not going to read to you the entire psalm, and it comes from Psalm 22, but I'm going to read parts of the psalm for you, and listen how closely this ties in with other things that happen around the crucifixion, and how similar they are, and how we could see in Jesus saying this one line, he's really meaning parts of the entire psalm. Here's from Psalm 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are wholly enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and they were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. I'm skipping verse 6, go to verse 7. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. I'm skipping down now to verse 14. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs are all around me. A company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and feet are shriveled. I can count all my bones. They stare and they gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far away. O my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the path of the lion. Then I'm going to skip down to verse 27. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. You see, I think that Jesus is not only crying out in anguish, I think he is also expressing a word of hope. He's acknowledging his pain, but he's also acknowledging God's authority and dominion and what God is accomplishing through his sacrifice, through his death, the full measure of that. As he repeats what people are doing in that time, they are mocking me, they cast lots for his clothing, all those things that you are doing. And also I think as the people hear Jesus say this, that what comes to their mind are these words from 22nd Psalm. And so they begin to question whether or not Elijah is going to come. And there's no firm and full consensus on the meaning of Elijah coming at this time, but there are a couple of main possibilities. One is that there were maybe a few people there who were trying to assist Jesus out of that pity and care for him. It's the thought of maybe they offered, at least, even though he didn't take it, they offered the myrrh as an analgesic, maybe to help ease the suffering. But then also Elijah was the greatest of the prophets. And remember, Elijah had never died. And so one of the things was, well, maybe Elijah is going to come down and take pity and come down and rescue Jesus. Others see the total opposite way of looking at it. They see it as maybe a further way of mocking Jesus, and maybe a way of offering the myrrh and making the claim about Elijah, maybe as a way to try to keep Jesus alive a little bit longer, maybe to see if Elijah will come. And maybe they really do get to see a grand sight then. And whatever is the case, and that phrase, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, Eloi, Eloi, he's calling out, my God, and some think, well, maybe he's calling out to Elijah, because that's the name that's mentioned there as well. It seems, though, that whichever is the case, they think he's calling out for Elijah when he's calling out to his Father, to Jesus, to God, his Father. Notice then that the centurion at the death of Jesus makes a proclamation of faith. Certainly this man was God's son. He becomes one of the earliest Gentiles to accept the divinity of Jesus, which gives us a foreshadowing to the universal nature of salvation in Jesus Christ. Now, just above, I made a brief mention about the temple of the curtain being torn in two, but I want to talk a little bit more about that, because it kind of the temple in the context of the centurion making this declaration. When Jesus breathes his last, as I said, the curtain of the temple rather is torn in two. It separated the temple, as I said, from the Holy of Holies. And I made mention that the high priest went in there only on the Day of Atonement. When the high priest, though, went into the Holy of Holies, one of the things that they did was they would tie a rope around the ankle of the priest. And periodically, and the high priest had bells on the tassels of the robe and the talit that he wore. He had the bells, and every occasion he would just kind of shake to show that he was alive, because it was believed that if the high priest died, then they would have to have the rope to be able to pull him out, because it was believed that if anybody other than the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, that they would die. And if the high priest went in at a time other than the Day of Atonement, that he would die, or that if he didn't show the proper reverence to God, then that high priest would die. It gives you an idea about the reverence and the awe that they had for this, and the importance of that curtain separating the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, where the Ark of the Covenant had been, and then the dwelling place of God. With the death of Jesus, that separation is no more. Through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, God reconciled humanity to himself. He bridged that gap that we created because of our sin, and he gave himself for us, even though we were the ones who had sinned against him. It's as if we go into a courtroom, and there's some courtroom language in them. If we go in a courtroom and there is somebody who is accusing us of something that we have done, and the person comes in and goes and accuses us of doing something wrong, and we admit that we have done something wrong, and yet the person who is accusing us and who has grounds for prosecuting us then says, I know that they're the ones who have done wrong, but I'm going to pay their penalty. I'm going to pay what their fee is. I'm going to serve whatever their judgment is for what they have done wrong. It would be as if a prosecutor says, I'm going to serve the defendant's sentence, even though I'm the one that's prosecuting the case against him. That's kind of what God did for us through Jesus Christ. We separated ourselves from God because of our sin. God says, you are guilty. He pronounces all humanity guilty, and we are. And yet he says, my love for you is so much, and my desire to forgive you and to offer that reconciliation is so great that I'm going to come down in the flesh and give of myself to pay your penalty, the penalty that you owe me. After the death of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea requests the body. Joseph is described in different ways in the Gospels. Matthew, we did not read, but Matthew makes the direct claim that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, even as Luke mentions that Joseph was a member of the council, presumably that being the Sanhedrin. But Luke also calls Joseph a righteous man. And he adds that Joseph disagreed with the actions of the Sanhedrin towards Jesus. John, again, who we did not read, adds the wrinkle that Nicodemus assisted Joseph in burying Jesus, and he makes the statement that Nicodemus was now a secret follower of Jesus. Now, there are a couple of speculations about why Joseph does this. One, in terms of the urgency, is because the law required those who were executed to be buried on the same day. And not only did they have that, they were also bumping up against the Sabbath, so there's kind of an extra measure and extra urgency there. The Roman practice for those crucified would be to leave those who were crucified up on the cross for days after the death, and the animals would come and pick, and it'd be just kind of a gross type of situation. But in Israel, because they knew that those who were Jewish people needed to be buried on the same day they were executed, they would allow when a Jewish person was crucified, they would allow the body to be taken down and buried on the same day as their death. The new tomb, the rock-hewn tomb, is an indication that people of the day would have certainly understood that Joseph is wealthy. We know he's a person of some importance. Again, it's also demonstrating that there's an urgency to this task. So it's possible that Joseph is just demonstrating his piety, but it's also possible that, as Matthew describes him as a disciple of Jesus, that it's an act of love towards Jesus as well as a fulfillment of the law. And it's why Joseph does everything he can to bury Jesus and get him buried properly in the time frame. Although we know, as we'll see in the next lesson with the resurrection, that we know that the reason the women go is because they're going to do that final act, that anointing of his body. One final detail to the crucifixion is that Mark and Luke list the women who were there, list that there are women who are there at the cross with Jesus. And take note, Mark mentions who is there: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and Joseph, and then Salome. So the women are there, and some of the other women who had followed him, who aren't mentioned, but that Jesus gave that pronouncement in the Gospel of Luke, they are there. Notice who isn't there. The disciples are not there. They're nowhere to be found at this point, although, as we'll see when we look at the resurrection, the women knew where they were hiding out at the time. As we kind of conclude this lesson, and for those who are watching this in the time frame in the week in which I am, in which it is first published, we are in the midst of Holy Week. We are just a couple of days away from the time of from Maundy Thursday and from Good Friday and then from the resurrection. So as we think about the crucifixion of Jesus and all these events that lead us from the triumphal entry of Palm Sunday through all the way through, what we see is these events that lead to this crucifixion of Jesus. The cross, along with the resurrection, is the defining point in human history. The cross demonstrates a God who is not only with us in our suffering, but who is willing to suffer for us, and one who suffers right along with us. One thing which the people of the day would have understood in great depth, and maybe greater depth than we understand it today, is that not only did Jesus sacrifice himself for us, but he did that through the cross, which they knew because they saw firsthand was the most painful and humiliating form of execution at that time, or really I could argue just about any time in history. Paul talks so eloquently in a variety of places about Christ enduring the shame of the cross, because in that day and time it was part of what it was done was an act of humiliation and shame. Paul says that the cross is a stumbling block to Jews because of that shame and humiliation, to dare that the Messiah was one killed, and he says it's foolishness for Gentiles. It's a stumbling block and it's foolishness because those who didn't believe that the Messiah could be killed, and death by means of crucifixion just didn't make sense to either one of them. The nature of the cross kind of precluded that this would be something that would be redemptive, that this would be something that would be positive, be something that anything good could come out of. And yet, what does Paul say? Paul says, we know these things, and yet we proclaim, those of us who believe, those of us who are saved, those who have accepted the death of Jesus Christ on the cross as God's reconciliation of us for our sins, reconciling humanity to himself, we proclaim Christ crucified. And we say what looks like foolishness and weakness to the world is power, is wisdom and power for God. And he says in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 25, for God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. All who believe and who come to faith in Jesus Christ understand that power and wisdom of God, and we get to experience that in this life and then for all eternity. That was the hope that Jesus offered to us and to the whole world on the cross almost 2,000 years ago. It's the same hope that we have today. It's not only the promise of the cross, but it's also the promise of the resurrection, as those two go together and are inextricably linked. And that is what we will look at the next lesson. Thank you for taking the time and joining me today in what I know was a longer than usual lesson, but I wanted, especially for those who are listening to it at first in the real time, for us to be able to cover all of these events and all of these happenings and the significance and power of the cross in this Holy Week as we prepare our hearts, as we recognize what it is Jesus went through for us, and as we prepare for what becomes the glory of Easter. Thank you for joining me today. God bless you and have a wonderful day in the Lord.